Good evening, everyone. It's Tim Ashe, President of the Vermont State Senate, here on June 4th with one of my Thursday, what I'm now calling an Ask Me Anything session. And I've had a bunch of questions coming in from around the state in the last few days. The predominant nature of the questions has really been about how does Vermont react, take action in light of um, what the murder of George Floyd represents more broadly about systemic injustice, discrimination. And while we know that that's a problem in every part of our society, the questions have largely focused on law enforcement, criminal justice system. And I think it makes sense because it is law enforcement who are in a position to use deadly force, restraint, and restrict our liberties using their discretion and judgment in ways that are different than many of the other forms of discrimination in our society. And there's um, a lot of reckoning that our nation has to do, that other nations have to do, and of course, Vermont is not immune to that. And before I turn to some of the questions, I just want to just reflect a little bit on the sort of where we've been. And I would entertain people who are in the legislative world that I inhabit, or people who are in the executive branch, meaning the governor's team or the attorney general and his team. I would welcome any of them to say that they see things differently than what I'm about to describe. And I would like them to say it publicly if they feel that way. I have, I think, like many people who are in public service, a general belief, sincerely held, that we first run for office or serve in some kind of public role because we want to improve things. We want people's lives to be better. We identify problems that need to be solved, injustices that need to be corrected, and we set about trying to do it. And some of us are more energetic in that effort. Some of us have different skill sets to bring to the equation. But I think that's generally why everyone gets into the public service universe. And one of the weird parts about being a legislator is that we don't run anything. We pass laws and then we hand it off to the executive branch, which is the governor, and all of the state agencies which fall under the governor. We hand things off to other constitutional officers like the attorney general, the state treasurer, the state auditor, secretary of state, and so on. They are the ones who actually do things. And so, one of the first instincts that legislators have when we see the crisis and the calling out for action around us is to say, but wait, I passed some law. I did the right thing. And I'll confess that I'm not immune from having those reactions sometimes. I think it's human to say, well, wait a sec, I'm not part of the problem. It's everybody else. And, coming back from the George Floyd rally and vigil in Battery Park in Burlington on Saturday, I had a number of, sort of emotional and other reactions to the gathering there and what it represented. People of all ages, people of every race that live in Vermont. And came away thinking, you know what? Park whatever feelings you have about whether the law you passed hasn't been recognized. It's not about you. Park all of that. This is not about the people who are in legislative offices or statewide offices and their records or anything. The question is really about injustice that others are experiencing. And so, with that, I'll just say a quick word about some of the things that I think represent the problem that one of the problems we face as we decide what to do to act now. So, in the last 4 or 5 years, maybe a little bit longer than that, I could give you a list of pieces of legislation that the Vermont has passed that are all very good. in that they seek to root out systemic racism, systemic injustice in our schools, in law enforcement, in state employment. And each one of them, when the bill became law, there was a lot of fanfare. Everyone was happy that we were collectively trying to confront these very difficult challenges and were willing to have difficult conversations. And while none of those bills are perfect, the passage of a bill into law, then people celebrate and say, we did good. We identified the problem. We thought we were taking a step. Few of the examples I would give, and I've mentioned some of these earlier in the week. We passed a law to require state police to all have body cameras and that they retain the data on the body cameras. We did that because we know that too many instances, the truth of what really goes on in some kind of situation is all left to the people who are doing the telling. And there has been a historic reluctance to treat both sides' stories equally. And this plays out often in situations that involve people of color, people with mental health challenges. And so we believe that body cameras would both protect people from injustices committed by law enforcement officers and would protect law enforcement officers so that their conduct, when it's totally appropriate, would be supported by the evidence. We passed legislation encouraging schools to reduce their reliance on the use of certain disciplinary measures, which we know have a disproportionate impact on students of color. We require law enforcement agencies to submit the race of people who are pulled over for traffic stops. We've hired a statewide racial equity director to think about how state agencies can be better trained in cultural competencies and make sure that the hiring practices and the disciplinary practices, all the things that come with the state's largest employer, which is the state itself, are done in the most equitable, proactive way to be inclusive. And that's just some of the legislation that we've passed. But also, while I was walking from Battery Park on Saturday, I thought, for all the times I've heard people say that, the activist community representing people of color, they're always wanting some new study, a new bill to look at more data, and sometimes the legislators think that, oh, woe is me. They keep asking me to do more to try to ferret out racial injustice. And as I was reflecting on seeing that, and experiencing that at the State House, I started to think about some of the bills that I've just described. And I thought, in every instance, we all celebrated the passage of the bill. We thought this is really going to be a big advance. And then something conspired to prevent it from being implemented either in a timely way or implemented at all. And I started to better understand the frustration, the built up sense that people aren't listening, because when the collective state officialdom, not just the legislature, but the executive branches who actually implement all this stuff, from the point of view of the citizen, they don't care if it's the legislature, the governor's office, the state's attorney, the attorney general. They're upset that their state government isn't stepping up to protect them. And so in each of the instances, they were right to say, why aren't you taking this particular issue seriously? And, when you really reflect on the body of work that a legislator would normally point to and say, here's my body of work as a legislator that shows how much I take this seriously and how much I care and how much I've poured into it to try to understand the issues and better address issues of injustice. And then the people who we are meaning to support and give an equitable stake in our state are saying, yeah, but it didn't happen. And they're not wrong. So I'm going to answer some questions now, some of which speak to some of the issues that I just raised, but hopefully as I answer them, I'm going to talk about what I suggest are steps forward to act, not just to diagnose what the problem is. And in each of these instances, I'd like to um, really communicate that on almost every one of the things I'm about to discuss, one of the most important things is that the impacted communities are actually included in the development of ideas. And that is something that state government has had to uh, really own up to and do a much better job of. And I think many of these ideas and proposals have been formulated either by communities of color or substantially by communities of color, and certainly with the inclusion. Um, that doesn't always make them perfect or right, but what it means is that we are not imposing a viewpoint that stems from a position of um, being free from discrimination based on the color of our skin and imposing our good ideas on those who do face that every day. So, first question, and this really gets to the body camera question, is so what happened with the body cameras and what's going to be done about it? The short story is I described why we required state law enforcement to have body cameras, and it has an obvious tie-in to protecting populations who may be more likely to suffer injustice at the hands of law enforcement, people of color, people with mental health challenges, people who are poor. And we passed the law, came back a year later, this past 2019, January, February, and the public safety department who run the state police came in and said, well, we didn't buy the body cameras because we're concerned that it'll cost too much money to store the data that's actually captured on the cameras. And we were quite upset to hear this. And what made it worse was that they proposed to take the money and use it to buy firearms, and not just any firearms, but AR-15s. And I'm sure someone at the Department of Public Safety, if they're watching this or hearing this, will not be happy to hear me saying this, but those are the facts. So we required them to go out to bid for body cameras because we thought that their numbers that justified their inaction were bogus. And this year, the budget was to include the money to buy the body cameras after all. And what we're worried about is that the economic crisis we're facing will be used as a justification not to do it. So the short story is I will be doing everything I can to make sure that the Public Safety Department, which runs the state police, buys the body cameras, even if it's at the expense of one of the things that they would prefer to spend it on. Enough's enough, and I think it's a simple action. No more RFPs, no more nonsense. Force them to buy the body cameras and do it by withholding money for something else. I don't think that there's going to be a way to get them to do it without compelling them to do it and making it clear that it's about priorities. If you're not going to prioritize it, we are going to do it for you. We are going to deprioritize the thing that you've prioritized. Second question I had, this is a tangential one. It says, body cameras can be useful, but what can be done to hold people accountable to the footage? Body cameras can be used to gather footage and the truth, but what can be done to hold people accountable to that? This is played out recently in an ACLU lawsuit brought about as a result of several young people of color in a city park and the interaction they had with law enforcement. And the access to the body camera data was restricted by the city of Burlington's police department, and the Attorney General's office seemed, it wasn't clear if they were, what position they had, but the long and short of it is that this body camera data, like all investigative information, should not merely just be distributed to the world. Oftentimes, the camera footage might include things that are very personal about someone. It might be a victim of domestic violence. So it's not so straightforward as to say everyone gets to watch this stuff. However, there clearly can be a process by which someone has access to the information in a secure place that won't be used inappropriately for commercialization or anything like that. And I think that in addition to funding the cameras this year in the budget and forcing them to buy them with consequences if they don't, will be policies about the access. Some of that is played out in the Supreme Court case, so we don't have to invent a whole new standard, but we'll want to review that case again and see how we make sure that people are held accountable. Next question, are Vermont children of color restrained or secluded at higher rates in local schools? It's a very interesting question. The legislature has attempted to get school districts throughout the state to adopt model disciplinary policies that include restorative justice in the school setting. What we do know from the data, this is a little bit dated, maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, that students of color are 2 to 3 times more likely to be subject of exclusionary discipline like suspension or expulsion, where they have to leave the school campus. In terms of seclusion and restraint, we don't have as specific data about that, but we know that children with mental health challenges in particular are going to be probably stand out in the data there if it existed. This has, I think, probably been increased as a result of school resource officers who are police officers who are in the schools. Merely by virtue of being there, it's more likely that a police officer will apply restraint. Seclusion and restraint is actually a very interesting area that I talked with the Senate Judiciary Chair today about how we may move forward this year with requirements around the use of restraint. The Woodside facility in Essex, which has been the, I don't know if incarcerative is the right word, but the secure facility for young people who have committed certain offenses. There was a lawsuit brought by the Defender General's office about the use of inappropriate restraints there, which settled, which is to say, I believe that the position of the court was that the Defender General's office was substantially correct that restraint was being inappropriately used. Restraint is the kind of thing like kneeling on someone or chokeholds and things like that. So you can see why this is absolutely critical and slightly different than the issue of the use of deadly force. So we are going to be looking at how we include new parameters around seclusion and restraint throughout the respective agencies in the state. So I cannot say that students of color are restrained or secluded at higher rates in local schools, though I can say that their discipline requires them to be removed from school more than white students. But I suspect seclusion and restraint follows roughly the same pattern, but that's a hunch based on intuition and not based on evidence. One person, this is not so much a question, but said they hope I will push for independent investigations of all police misconduct, for public access to misconduct reports, and for accountability, and that this is long overdue. And I believe that we are due to develop a method for real accountability of particular types of police misconduct. One of the unusual aspects of the state's sort of accountability measures is that there's a certain review panel that handles these kinds of law enforcement cases, and there's sort of internal accountability, but when it ends at that last stop, there's no accountability beyond that. So the public and people like me in my role don't have access or to what's been learned or an insight into how they do it. So I believe that this will be something that we're talking about in the coming couple months, and I want to remind people the legislative session will not be over when we leave in June. It's being we'll go on hiatus until about mid-August. So we will get some things done by the end of June, and then others we'll keep working on later in the summer. COVID has obviously thrown everything off, so I won't glibly say be patient, but knowing that many of these policies are not straightforward, they take time, and with everything else we're doing all at once, it's like crisis on top of crisis. Some of the bills may have to get taken up in late August. Question about a bill called H808. For those of you who do not follow the legislative process, which probably makes a good number of you, much to my sadness, when a bill is described as H808, it means that it is a House bill. If it was S-808, that would mean it's a Senate bill. And 808 just means it's the 808th bill that's been introduced in a particular 2-year legislative session. So with that little civics out of the way, H808 is about the use of deadly force. In the wake of what's been going on the last week, some activists have been calling for passage of H808 this year. And to be completely honest, the bill's in the House, so I haven't been part of any discussions they've had, but it was not going to move. And when I say move, that means advance and potentially become law. There are some who say, let's turn it into a task force to look at policies around the use of deadly force. And to that, I have to say this is not, in my opinion, the starting point we should have for how to talk about the use of deadly force. So for those of you who go, if you want to go to the legislative website, so just go Google Vermont legislature, and you'll see a white bar that pops up, and type in 808. And when you hit return, it's going to show you, it's going to find you H808, and then one of the options will say as introduced. That means that's how the bill was first presented to the world. And click on that and just read it. And after you've read it, you email me if you think that we need to wait to adopt that bill. Nothing that I read in there is something that needs to wait 5 years, 4 years, 3 years for multiple task forces. So I'm going to be advocating for moving now with the use of deadly force policies that are imagined there. Yes, every bill requires some modification and adjustment, so that would be totally fair. But I do not believe we need to defer another year or more to a task force. So my hope is to advocate strongly to move forward with the legislation. And if they want to create a task force to continue to think about possible revisions, that's fine. But this is one of those examples where we can keep kicking it down the road, or we could take action using the best information we have right now, and I think we can do that. Another question arises around another bill, which is also sort of being promoted as one of the things that we should be acting on. This is H464. Same thing. Go to the legislative website. If you type in 464, there'll be two options. And there'll only be one. H464. Click on As Introduced. This one relates to de-escalation tactics in law enforcement, cross-cultural awareness in law enforcement, and the appropriate use of force in law enforcement. And that's another bill that probably was not going to make it to the finish line this year, but now is being called for. It does a few things, really. In regards to de-escalation tactics, it requires that certain training be done of law enforcement and that data be collected around when situations have occurred that have been able to be resolved using de-escalatory tactics. Same with the use of force, providing certain information so that those can be judged. The cross-cultural awareness is largely a training piece to make sure that law enforcement officers, when they're being trained, are exploring things outside of their own norms so that they don't have the same likelihood of viewing someone as other, but rather understanding our implicit biases, respecting the differences that we have rather than being worried about them, and being able to understand some of the subtle differences of the way people express themselves, whether it's verbally or with clothing or mannerisms, to avoid bad situations. So that's another piece of legislation I believe we can move before we get done this year. But what I want to say about that, and this is not an easy one to say because I know that many activists are very strongly calling for this bill right now. The bill, as I told you before, I've helped write 5 or 6 bills, all of which, if they were in the process right now, people would be demanding that we pass them into law. Passing the bill is not the end of the story. Once the bill's passed, it's all about how it's implemented or if it's even implemented. So having data collection be required is only as good as the actual collection of the data and the use of the data to do something with it. In terms of traffic stop data with racial information, in the first couple of years, there were law enforcement agencies who either didn't or didn't submit it at all, or wouldn't submit it in ways that made any sense. It was bad data. As a result, you couldn't determine which agencies had bigger problems with disproportionate traffic stop based on race. And as a result, you can't dive into it and understand what might have explained that, short of injustice. And the consequences were effectively nothing. And so now the data is being submitted, I believe, by every law enforcement agency as of the last report, which is good news. But what's the consequence if they don't again? What's the consequence if the data isn't clean, not really usable? And right now, I'm not sure that there is much of a consequence. So I will be revisiting an issue like that because passing the bill is not good enough. It's the what then. And if there's an agency that is out of whack, then I think we really got to have some consequences for them. A select board should know that there will be financial consequences if their police department does not satisfactorily contribute to trying to solve a social justice issue. The de-escalation tactics and cultural awareness trainings and all that, they can't just be required. They have to be meaningful, and there has to be follow-up, and they have to produce the outcomes that we hope we are going to see. Otherwise, we've got problems. It's why I worry about task forces being developed everywhere, because task forces get controlled by the people who run them, and the recommendations, half of them languish, and then they all feed back into the same cycle of we have a moment where we're all saying we've got to confront this and now's the occasion to take action. By the time a task force puts out a report, you know what? We're going to be past COVID. People are going to be back at work. People are going to be focusing on other things. And I pray that we won't have, although I know I'm wrong to think that this is going to be the case, but if we don't have another George Floyd for the next 3 months, will people be as focused and committed to getting this done as a priority? And so those are the kinds of reasons I get very worried about the establishment of yet another task force. Sometimes they're helpful. They help us all come together and play out the strengths and weaknesses of ideas. Other times they can be a secondary issue, but take the action first and then have a task force to refine it. So I think you're getting my general flavor for that. I think I'm probably going to wrap there. I think I've touched on a handful of some of the most short-term and things that the legislature can take action on. I should add that we also have a long way to go in the way that new Americans are treated. Obviously, they show up under the same data in terms of people of color and the way they're impacted in their treatment by law enforcement. But we also know that the language barriers in particular present real potential for conflict. And I'm very determined that as the number of new Americans in our state grows, which I hope it'll grow more, that we need to make sure that law enforcement really understands how to interact with people who may have limited to no English, whose ability to carry out certain daily duties would be exemplary in their home country, but as they adjust to the U.S., they may struggle to do the same things here because the signage is different, the people are different, everything's different. So we have much more to do on that front as well. And then I do have to conclude by saying something that I think is really important, which is that we also have to have in mind first that there are many wonderful law enforcement officers. I grew up in a family that had law enforcement officers in it. And I know that I've never spoken to an activist who believes that every law enforcement officer is terrible and sets out to commit offenses that are based on racial discrimination. But setting that piece aside, though, I think it is important that we express that because we're also seeing wonderful examples all around the country of compassionate law enforcement officers and chiefs who are stepping up to do the right thing police in the right way, which is as peace officers and keeping people safe rather than imperiling their safety. But we also have to make sure that what we're doing is creating a profession moving forward that draws people who are interested in the strength of communities, the well-being of communities. And as we think about the kind of training that people need, the kind of life experiences they need, the kind of skills that they need, we have to have in mind it's not a question about just handling bad apples now. It's about creating a profession that people would be proud to serve in moving forward, that the public will look and say, wow, to become a police officer is really hard because you have to confirm all the best about yourself and how you view others and what your mission is. We need to reinvigorate that sense. Many of our state's law enforcement officials, I think, go into it with that mindset. But I think we have a lot of repair work to do to make it real that that is an expectation of everyone who goes into that field, and to make the public confident that we have a law enforcement community that is populated entirely by people who view their work in that framework. So those are aspirational but achievable things if we take action and not defer. And if we all stay on top of the laws we pass as we contemplate even more legislative work to set in motion much needed reform. So these are hugely important discussions, and I guess I'll leave it by saying even much more desperately needed actions. So I will see you tomorrow at 5:30. I'm going to be talking with some people who are on the front lines of mental health from Central Vermont, and I think you'll find the experience they've gone through with the clients they serve very interesting. And I will look forward to seeing you tomorrow at 5:30.